Our lesson comes from the second chapter of Isaiah, as our readings throughout Advent are coming from Isaiah. The situation, if we backtrack from Jesus about 7 centuries, is that the northern 10 of the 12 kingdoms of Israel have been utterly conquered and destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. That empire's army are now at the gates of Jerusalem when Isaiah's prophecy is being given. And it is a dire time for the people of Judah and Benjamin, the two remaining tribes who are walled up within Jerusalem. And the prophet Isaiah, as many of the prophets of Israel have said, don't listen to the false prophets who say, "Shalom, shalom," when there is no shalom. And so as many of our readings for Advent and Christmas come from the prophet Isaiah, it's an appropriate focus for us for this season together. Let us listen from the second chapter of Isaiah to the words of the prophet. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." May God bless to us these words of hope, even in the face of devastation from the prophet Isaiah. For this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Speaking of Isaiah, during my initial seminary training, which was a few years ago, we had a visiting professor at Princeton Seminary. It was Dr. John Bright. He was on loan for a year from Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Dr. Bright was a noted Old Testament scholar, and he was teaching a class that was entitled Isaiah of Jerusalem. And it was we were thirsting so much for this class. There were over 150 people who came to this one class. Basically, Isaiah of Jerusalem was the first 39 chapters of Isaiah that are directly attributable to the prophet in the days before their captivity and their exile of Jerusalem. So, as I said, about 150 us students and professors were crammed into this large lecture hall. And at one point in the lecture, Dr. Bright began quoting by memory in English a long passage from the prophet Isaiah. And that was astounding in itself, that he was quoting such a long passage in English. But it was the first time I ever remember that several students interrupted a professor in mid-lecture, because they were bold enough to say to him, Dr. Bright, we don't understand a word you're saying." Because the most astounding part of the entire course then came out of Dr. Bright's mouth. He said, "Oh, was I speaking in Hebrew?" Yes, was I speaking in Hebrew? Can you imagine that you'd have to ask someone if suddenly, unbeknownst to you, you were speaking in Hebrew from English? Well, we were all in complete awe. Here was someone so connected to the words and the prophecy and the life and the angst and expectations and pathos of the prophet Isaiah, that he began speaking in Isaiah's native tongue. It seemed to us almost that if it was the prophet Isaiah himself speaking to us, and he was. And it was from that moment on I realized I was going to focus my seminary work on original language study of the Bible, the Greek and the Hebrew, so that at least in some small measure I might try to connect to the biblical witness the same way that Dr. Bright did. Now, Dr. Bright, in that lecture and during that year, he was an angel. And by that I mean he was a presence that day in my life, because in the biblical languages, the word angel and the word for messenger are the same word. In the biblical language, it's the same term. And those terms are also at the heart of the gospel, the good message, the good news. And so conveying that good message in Advent is what the season of Advent is all about as we prepare for the Christmas birth. And our calling, all of our calling, is to share that good message as a resulting expectation of this season. If we have ears to hear the angels all around us, angels all the time, messengers of hope, conveyors of peace, in Hebrew shalom, what they say to our listening ears changes our lives. What is it that we sing? Do you remember this one? Do you hear what I hear? Yeah? Ringing through the sky, shepherd boy, do you hear what I hear? A song, come on with you, a song high above the trees with a voice as big as the sea, with a voice as big as the sea. Yeah, we're channeling Ed Ames here. Or for some of you, pentatonics. You know, I don't know if we hear that voice as big as the sea anymore in these days. The voice as big as the sea is sometimes drowned out by all the crowds of people who are wrestling through the night, waiting for Black Friday. Or the stores opening at 5 p.m. on Thanksgiving now in order to fight over the doorbuster sales. It's hard to filter the singing through the night, through the shouting of nations at war or threatening war or coercing each other with war or weapons or lack of weapons, or ultimately concerned about grasping power and little concerned with human life and dignity. We can't hear the singing. Sometimes maybe we've covered our ears lest we have to listen to the endless political bickering and posturing and lying, while acts of compassionate governance grind to a halt. It's very noisy out there, isn't it? So where can we hear the angels, the messengers, singing God's message of shalom? Well, as strange and perhaps obvious as it may seem, we don't have to just look into the dark night sky, because we can hear that message right here amidst the community of faith, gathered with our expectant hearts and our open ears and our receptive lives. Right here, with a wreath of candles and green, waiting for Christ to arrive, be born, offer himself to us for no reason other than love itself. And here at a table of Jesus' shalom, which is offered to all. And here, a baptismal font, a font of rebirth and of holy promise. If we really want the world to make more sense, shouldn't we take seriously our calling from God to invite our friends and our neighbors and our families and everyone we know and everyone we don't know to worship with us, to listen together for the angel's message of shalom? Here. It can happen. It can happen. At the ripe old age of 27, a man with 2 novels under his belt, and one of them, A Long Day's Dying, extravagantly praised by critics, a young author named Fred Buechner moved to New York City to try his hand at writing. But he hit a wall. He hit the wall. He found himself unable to write anything. He even contemplated maybe other careers. Now, uncharacteristically for Fred, simply because the building was a block from his apartment, he started attending the Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church, and it was pastored in those days by the celebrated preacher George Buttrick. It was around the time of Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and Fred heard a sermon that he changed his life, literally. Buttrick was contrasting Elizabeth II's coronation. He was contrasting it with the coronation of Jesus in the believer's heart, which he said which should take place among confession and tears. And Fred says, oh, so far, so good. And this is what he writes. And then, with his head bobbing up and down so that his glasses were glittering, he said in this odd, sandy voice, the voice of an old nurse, that the coronation of Jesus took place among confession and tears, and then, as God is my witness, great laughter, he said. Jesus is crowned among confession and tears and great laughter, and at the phrase great laughter, for reasons I've never satisfactorily understood, the Great Wall of China crumbled and Atlantis rose up out of the sea, and on Madison Avenue at 73rd Street, tears leapt from my eyes as if I had been struck across the face. At times after that, Fred Buechner, who now, as many of us might know, has become a noted author, writer, Presbyterian minister, philosopher, had been tempted to interpret his conversion experience here in psychological terms or life stage terms, but he resisted that temptation. Instead, Fred sees it as an example of crazy holy grace, he says, that wells up from time to time through the flaws and fissures in the bedrock harshness of things. And sometimes, he writes, even when life's punches seem to be the hardest, when it is unfair and unkind and even unknown, that's when God's grace, that's when God's shalom grabs us the most, and we finally release our control to give God control, or at least some control. Amid the tears and the confession and ultimately the great laughter, God touches us with shalom. That's the kind of aha experience we all need. God's grace, God's unique shalom is so real, and faith calls upon us. It calls upon us to expect great things, to expect that our worship together should, if not the worship provide, at least give God the chance to provide shalom. From the beginning of his prophetic ministry, the prophet Isaiah knew that it was going to be the pridefulness and the faithlessness of the people that would be their undoing. Because he saw that rather than honoring and following the reign of God, the sovereignty of God, as in the wilderness days, the people had come to trust in earthly kings and political intrigues and their own versions of human ritual purity to their now looming doom. But even so, as we heard, Isaiah proclaimed a word of hope, a message that lifted up an expectation of God's shalom for not just the Hebrews, but all people. Even his name, Isaiah, it means God's salvation. And our faith continues to cling to his words, don't they? That swords become plows, and spears can become pruning hooks, and nations can live in peace. He wasn't mouthing religious-sounding words of delusional hope. Isaiah was an angel, a messenger. He was speaking God's truth to those who did have the ears to hear, who did have the courage to understand. So wrapped into all of that shalom is expectation, and there's confession, and there's tears, and there's laughter, and there's holy, crazy grace. And you put all that together, it equals shalom. And isn't that what Jesus says to us today in Advent? Wake up! Wake up! Pay attention. Be alert. Because when the word comes to you, it's going to change your life. And whether you are a Frederick Buechner or whether you are a, insert your own name right here, the angel message is going to be here for you and yours and those you know and those you love and those you don't know and those you don't love yet. This is the message of Christ that's offered to us every time. Shalom, peace, grace, future, starting in this present moment. There's a poem I just want to share with you that's one that's anonymous. At least it's anonymous to my knowledge. But it's one I've kept for probably 30 years. It's a poem of expectation. Because after all the noise of the long-spanning Advent season subsides, the tinsel's gone, the package paper compressed in the bins, and the signs move on to the next season for shopping, which is Valentine's, I guess. Probably already out there. And the decorations start to make their way back to attic, closet, basement. There is something totally unexpected and hilariously important that remains, and it's the quiet message of the angels, the messengers, that remain around us in this sanctuary each and every week and in the daily places we inhabit. So quiet, we almost miss it. Sometimes the angels sing so quietly I hardly hear their jubilates. Peace and goodwill are lovely words to sing at Christmas when my arms are full of gifts and for my loved ones, and my eyes are full of stars. But on ordinary days, when the world is not drenched in peace and goodwill, alleluias are mighty big gifts to expect from mortal beings like myself. I can smile at my neighbor when peace and goodwill mean sharing what I've got. The song of the angels grows faint. Or do you suppose that's what he meant when he said, listen, if you've got ears to hear? Advent begins today. Christmas Day is 3.5 weeks away. Maybe that seems like a problem. Maybe it seems like a long time to wait and watch and wonder and prepare. But it also gives us a bit more space to reflect, doesn't it? And wonder. A little more time for angelic input. A little more time to generate faith-driven output. There's a lot of expectation in Advent, lodged in a sacramental time, because it makes every day from now until December the 25th, and perhaps beyond, holy time as receivers of angelic tidings and bearers of angelic tidings to all. So friends, listen if you've got ears to hear those angels who sing so quietly. Happy, and I hope, shalom-filled Advent to us all.